שלום תלמידים, האלף בית העברית, פרק ד' יצורים במראה דומה. The Hebrew Alphabet Lesson 4, Consonants that Look Alike. As we've been learning the Hebrew consonants, you may have noticed that some of the consonants are confusingly similar to each other. In this video, I'm going to give you some tips to be able to tell them apart. Beseder? Okay? Let's start with the two most commonly confused Hebrew letters. On the right, we have Daleth, and on the left, we have Resh. They were confused in ancient times by scribes, and they still cause lots of problems for students. When you are writing Daleth and Resh, please make sure that you write them differently from each other. How can we tell the difference? A Resh has a smooth curve where the top and the side join. You see? A Daleth, on the other hand, doesn't have a smooth curve. It has a projection, which we call in English a tittle. Most of us have only heard this word in the English Bible when, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Not one jot or tittle will depart from the law." The tittle is this little thing that distinguishes a Daleth from a Resh. In English, we can also talk about the dot on an I or a lowercase j as a tittle. By the way, a jot in the King James Version of the Bible, in that sentence, is actually a yod, which is the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, now look at Daleth and final kaf. Daleth on the right, and final kaf, or kaf sofit, on the left. The Daleth, as we saw before, has a tittle. So does the final kaf. How do we tell the difference between these two? Look, the final kaf dips below the writing line, sort of blue line I put in for you, whereas the Daleth stops at the writing line. Now let's look at Resh, Daleth, and Kaf Sofit together. Both Daleth and Kaf Sofit have tittles. Resh doesn't. Both Resh and Daleth stop at the writing line, whereas Kaf dips below the writing line. So when you are writing these three consonants, please be careful to keep them distinct. Make sure that Resh is smooth without a tittle, and make sure that final Kaf clearly goes below the writing line. Now let's look at Beit and Kaf. In Beit, we have a tittle at the bottom right, whereas in Kaf, we have no tittle. So the main difference between Beit and Kaf comes in the lower right of the letter. These are very easy to mix up. Here are Kaf and Pei. Do you see how they share a same basic body type? But in Pei, there's an extra stroke. The same thing shows up with the final forms of Kaf and Pei. Pei still has its extra stroke. Now, as well, both forms dip below the line. And notice that Kaf, final Kaf, Kaf Sofit, has a tittle, whereas Pei Sofit, at least in some fonts, like this one, doesn't have one. Here are Gimel and Nun. The only difference between Gimel and Nun, really, is that Gimel has a tail, and it's written in two strokes, whereas Nun has no tail, and is written with only one stroke. And now, Zayin versus Vav. Notice that with Vav, the letter is written with one stroke from the top to the bottom, whereas in Zayin, the top stroke extends past the vertical stroke a little. So it's written in two strokes. There is, in effect, a tittle on Zayin, while there is not one on Vav. Now let's look at Yod, Vav, and final Nun, or Nun Sofit. They're all written in one stroke with the same basic shape. The only difference between them is how long they are. So Vav stops at the writing line, Yod stops above the line, and Nun Sofit, final Nun, extends below the line. When you write these three consonants, make sure your Yod is distinctly shorter than your Vav, and that your final Nun is distinctly longer than your Vav. In fact, in some manuscripts, like some of the Dead Sea Scrolls from around a couple hundred BC, it can be really hard to tell the difference between a Vav and a Yod. The Vavs are kind of short and the Yods are kind of long, so you get sort of a 3/4 length consonant. So just make sure that your Yod stops well above the line and your final Nun extends well below the line, and everything will be fine. Now let's look at Tzadi and final Tzadi, or Tzadi Sofit. Notice that with Tzadi, it's got this kind of tail that sits on the line, whereas in Tzadi Sofit, it looks like it's been straightened out and its tail extends below the line. This is important. Now let's look at Tzadi and Ayin. They look rather a lot alike, don't they? Sort of like they have their hands in the air. The way to tell the difference between the two is that in Tzadi, the left arm is part of the main stroke of the letter, and the right arm is sort of added on to it. Whereas the exact opposite is true for Ayin, where the right arm is the main stroke. Also notice that Tzadi looks a little bit like it's kneeling down. It's sort of doubled back on itself. Do you see it? When we throw in final Tzadi to these two, however, it looks a little bit trickier. You see, the final Tzadi and the Ayin can look an awful lot alike. The final Tzadi extends below the line, whereas the regular Tzadi sits on the line. But notice the Ayin sometimes extends slightly below the line. They all look like they have their hands in the air. But notice that the Tzadis, both forms of the Tzadi, have the left arm as their main stroke, and the Ayin has its main stroke as the right arm. Now let's look at Mem Sofit, or final Mem, and Samek. They look extremely similar, don't they? The main difference is that in final Mem, you have two square corners at the bottom, whereas in Samech, it's a bit more rounded. Sometimes there's a one corner at the bottom, sometimes there's not even that. When you're writing these two letters, I encourage you to write final Mem as a square and Samek as much more of a circle, so that they're very clearly distinct from each other. Here we have three consonants that look quite a lot alike: He, Chet, and Tav. In He, there is a gap on the left-hand side of the letter. In Chet and Tav, there is no gap. When you're writing these letters, please make a very clear gap for He and a very clear lack of a gap for Chet, especially Chet, and also Tav. Notice also that Tav has a little foot that sticks out to the left. We end with our two friends, Sin and Shin. I pointed out several times that the only difference between them is where the dot is put. Do you remember our little saying? When the dot is on the left, it's a sin, because sin is never right. Of course, this assumes that you can keep your right and left straight, which sometimes I have trouble with. Whereas in shin, the dot will be on the right. So remember, sin, the dot is on the left, because sin is never right.